Welcome to Clarity Fund Podcast with Dr. Owen Anderson. This is episode 20, and we're continuing in our series on rebuilding the historic Christian faith, which is brought to us by Logos Theological Seminary and our guest, Dr. Surrendra Gangadean. Thank you again for joining us.
Glad to be here, Owen.
We're looking today at the Council of Carthage, which occurred toward the end of the 4th century and was especially about the canon of Scripture. So we're continuing as we're going through the series on the different councils to think about the historic Christian faith and the challenges that each council addressed. So today we'll be looking at that question of the canon of Scripture. Where do you want to begin with that?
Well, we need to ask some questions about the assumption of Scripture. Scripture comes to us as redemptive revelation, and we need to keep in mind constantly that redemptive revelation assumes clear general revelation. Redemptive revelation assumes the distinction between good and evil, and in redemption we're being brought out of evil, sin and death, back to good, life in knowing God. So if we want to be able to address the questions that come up about the canon, we have to start with the assumptions about the necessity for Scripture.
Yeah, I should say that we have on the webpage, thelogospapers.com, paper number 11 goes over the topic of how we get from general revelation to special revelation.
Right.
So that covers what you were just mentioning about the necessity of Scripture. Why do we need Scripture or special revelation at all?
So another way to look at this is when we come to redemption and redemptive revelation, we have to think about what goes before redemption, which is the fall of man and the entry of moral and natural evil into the world. And before that, we have to go back to creation, the creation account in Genesis 1, and the covenant of creation in Genesis 2. And without those two pieces, we cannot and should not try to speak about Scripture, let alone the canon of Scripture. So,
well, then that'll help address one of the arguments that have come up between Christians, which is what is most authoritative? Did the church determine the canon, or does the Scripture shape the church? And really what you're doing is helping us focus on the content of Scripture. That's what would help us know what the canon is.
Yes, and even if we have to back up, and I think we do, from Carthage to general revelation, we'll see the content of general revelation is necessary condition for accepting anything as Scripture. In other words, special revelation must be consistent with general revelation. And we must not only have consistency, but the necessity for. Remember, the deists in the 17th century questioned the necessity of Scripture and thought that reason was sufficient, reason and general revelation. As it turned out, they did not do justice to either reason or general revelation, both of which are, in that order, reason and general revelation, the way in which the Logos comes to us. So reason and general revelation, then Scripture, then the incarnation, which is the fulfillment of the promise in redemptive revelation. And after that, we get to the completion of Scripture with the New Testament and the canonization of the books of the New Testament. So that's what Carthage is particularly looking at.
And the way you just described it helps remove some of the tension that is supposedly there between reason and revelation. So the deist would say, we just need reason, and revelation is really a kind of superstitious stories that humans have accumulated over the centuries, and we need to get rid of those and become enlightened.
No, I'd say the full use of reason requires special revelation.
Yeah.
And it's the failure to use reason fully that comes short. For example, in the problem of evil, which is a universal problem, assuming creation just now, if God is all good and all powerful, why is there evil? And only after we get to the existence of evil and in an explicit form, natural evil and moral evil, and that natural evil, toil, strife, old age, sickness, and death, is due to moral evil, the failure to seek and understand what is clear about God. Only in that context can we speak about the necessity for special revelation and the content of special revelation and the origin of special revelation and the existence of special revelation. So I'd like to say right now we're approaching this question deductively, speaking about the necessity for special revelation, and then go to the existence of special revelation in the same way that we would approach the resurrection of Christ. We go from the necessity of resurrection in general to the necessity for the resurrection of Christ to the actuality of the resurrection of Christ. The empirical approach, which is the basis of evidentialism, as if we can have facts without interpretation, that comes short continually in many ways in terms of probability. And thoughtful persons have raised questions about that again and again. Probability does not amount to anything that is sufficient. In the case of redemption and committing our whole lives to that, it's not sufficient for that. And there are other problems with probability. We can't even get off the ground with probability without getting to the clarity, such as there's no uncaused event, there's no being from non-being, there must be something eternal. If we cannot agree on that to begin with, we can't even speak about probability later on. We may speak about it in a psychological sense, a subjective sense.
That's more like what they call plausible. Plausibility means I find it plausible, which is really more a comment about me than about the data.
It could be that. It could be taken in a stronger sense, assuming certain things in place. We can speak about, in light of early assumptions, whether this is probable or merely possible.
Yeah.
But that's for another time to develop if we need to.
This also helps, talking about the deductive approach, think about what was going on in a council like Carthage, where they're thinking about the canon. So they're not determining the canon so much as discovering the canon. Is that a good distinction?
Or let me back up between determining and discovering. The canon was recognized broadly going back to around 325 AD or Common Era. And Eusebius stated the canon, which is consistent with what was affirmed later on. There were disputes in some cases, questions that have been raised in some places by some. In terms of the formation of canon, there had to be some kind of report concerning the origin. When the letter to Philippi came there and may have been shared with Colossians, there's a line of transmission, the Philippians and the Philippian church succeeding could say, this is the letter of Paul. We had it here, and we're witnesses to that. And Paul came to Philippi and spoke, and Timothy and others. And so we know that this is of Paul. But what about the churches in Laodicea and the church in Corinth, which did not have a certain degree of contact? That lack of coordination, especially during the time of persecution before Constantine, that coordination had to occur. So in that context, the question of canonization of the New Testament books occurred. But some persons, not all, some persons may have recognized all and only the New Testament books, and we think this was going on with Eusebius. And he was just the lead person. He did not come up with this all by himself, independently of anyone else. And he's just expressing what was a consensus at that time, at least sufficient for him. But when questions linger, you have to have more discussion to clarify it.
So that gets to, that the process of discovering it, which of them was written by Paul, their authenticity in terms of their authors, but then also the content as scriptural content.
Yeah, the question of content in general precedes the question of the that this is from Paul, including the writing of Moses in Deuteronomy, I think around 28 or 20 says, how do you know that a prophet is sent from the Lord? Twofold, he must speak in the name of the Lord, and secondly, what he says must come to pass. There must be a sign. First of all, it must be according to the name of the Lord. That is what is clear about God from general revelation. I believe that's the most basic sense of the name of the Lord. And when there's further revelation that's established, subsequent revelation must be consistent not only with general revelation, but what has gone before.
Yeah. So that's what I meant by discovering, as opposed to the modern view might be that they simply picked these books. They might have had political reasons or personal reasons for picking these books. And there are other books they left out, like the Gospels.
Yeah, this is where we have to say, and we should have make this clear. Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 1, is on Scripture. And there it addresses necessity of Scripture in light of the opening line about the clarity of general revelation. Explicitly uses the word necessity of Scripture, that is, not just special revelation, but special revelation written down. The necessity of Scripture emphasizing the writing. And then it speaks about the transmission of Scripture and how it's kept pure and entire by God, and the completion of Scripture, to which nothing more is to be added. All these points are raised. And then it also speaks about the translation of Scripture. It speaks about the interpretation of Scripture. All of these points are there in chapter 1 of the Westminster Confession of Faith, building on the work that has gone before. So it's important to keep that background in mind. Remember, rational presuppositionalism, if we agree on the more basic, we can agree on the less basic. Now, Scripture is not only necessary and has a certain content, which we can know from general revelation. It must be consistent with what is clear from general revelation, and it must answer the question that was raised by general revelation in terms of the problem of evil and the curse as a callback or mercy. And that is, how can God be just and merciful to man and sin? Justice and mercy seem to go against each other. That question must be answered.
So it's on that point that Gospels of Gnostics, for example, are ruled out. They're not even competitors because they're not affirming any of those things.
Well, yes. Going back to the creation and fall doctrine, they do not affirm the creation doctrine. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, ex nihilo, and they do not affirm the doctrine of the fall. And that's true also if Islam, I say if because they're questions of interpretation, affirms creation as against momentary creation, no second causes, God continually upholding. It does not affirm the fall of man, and therefore it cannot speak about the need for redemption. It sets it up as a system of laws and obey or disobey, etc. But there's no redemption to speak of in Islam. But we know God is both just and merciful from general revelation, but we don't know in light of the fall where the sin of one man affected all, or natural evil, physical death, came in because of moral evil.
Yeah.
As by one man all died, as in Adam all died. Sin entered the world through one man and the sin of one man. That's the fall. If we don't have the creation and fall, we can't have redemption. And if we don't have the necessity and content of it, we can't see that it must originate from God. And a lot of modern scholars think it's a natural human document, like so many other religions, and they're generalizing from that. But it has to be from God. And if it has to be from God, then the question of, is there any such book that exists that affirms creation, fall, redemption? And we say, yes, there is one. The Bible. It affirms creation, fall, redemption in Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And everything else follows, builds on that, and is consistent with that.
Yeah, and that's why you rule out Gnostics, which are dualists. They're not even affirming God. So they might use the word God, but that's an ambiguous word. They're using it in the dualistic sense, not as God the creator.
There are many terms as dualists. There are also monists who attempt to interpret Scripture in light of a monistic view that all is one. But here again, from general revelation, there are certain necessary conditions for morality. There must be a metaphysical absolute. If all is one, you cannot give a rational distinction between good and evil. There must be personal immortality. If there's no continuity, there's no rational grounds for morality. There must be freedom. There must be clarity. If there's no clarity, there's no morality. You can't rationally distinguish good and evil. And there must be rationality. This is not clear intuitionally, which is more subjective, but objective in terms of the loss of thought and retaining the meaningful distinction between good and evil. Most persons who speak on morality don't have all five of those conditions lined up as necessary condition for morality, this rationally distinguishing good and evil, and therefore you cannot speak of redemption. We hear, for example, Eastern
redemption
teachers,
becomes more like a growth or personal achievement.
Yes, but even then you cannot speak about personal achievement because you cannot say whether consciousness is good and lack of consciousness is evil. Is animal existence evil? It's just natural. Is human existence better than animal existence, or it's just different? You have no rational basis for distinguishing good and evil. You can't say ignorance is bad. Animals are ignorant in terms of the kinds of things that we discuss. And so the Eastern teachers say there's a whole line of teachers and we need them, but that's another appeal to special revelation. And if there's no clear general revelation, there's no morality, there's no need for teachers. And if it is clear, in terms of a dilemma, we also don't need teachers.
Yeah.
So if it's not clear, there's no need for teachers. And if it is clear, there's no need for teachers unless you get to a certain level. And you get into, it's clear and there's sin in the context of clarity. And the context of sin says, if it's clear, then there's self-deception about seeking and not seeking, not understanding. and self-justification. Now you can speak about the curse as a callback and the promise as redemption.
Yeah.
And then you have the necessity for Scripture. And that's what the first section of chapter 1 of the confession would maintain. And I believe that's what the people at Carthage and leading up to Carthage were operating with. What happens is that the challenges that occur in history forces us to become more explicit about that.
Yeah. And that gets to what you said earlier about the standard set by Moses in Deuteronomy 18.
Yes.
I think it's 15 through 22. He gives a standard for how to determine a true and false prophet, and that's what he's laying out as well.
Thank you. It is 18. Thank you.
Yeah. Speaking in the name of the Lord, that is consistent with the revelation God has given, including general revelation.
Starting with general revelation.
Yeah, so if you come and you have a Gnostic gospel, you've already abandoned that. You've already conflicted with general revelation. Now, one quick question about Carthage that's going to come up for sure is it does lay out the canon of the Old Testament, but then it includes the apocryphal books. So then when we get to the Westminster Confession, what it says about those is that they're not to be made of, given any more use than, they're not part of the canon, they're not to be given any more use than other books written by men.
Right.
So how do we make sense of that? Did Carthage include those or not?
Well, first of all, canonization is by the church at the time. And the church before Christ were the people of Israel and the leaders of Israel. And they're the ones to speak to the question of the canon of what we call the Old Testament. And they identified all the books and only the books, excluding the Apocrypha.
Yeah, they never did make that part of their canon, even if they did use it for other things.
Yes. So it never has been. The Masoretic text does not include any apocryphal work. And the Jews have been inclined to raise up a lot of other things in terms of the Talmud and the rabbinic tradition, and may even regard them more highly than the Scripture. But even with that just shows that they drew a line between Scripture and everything else. Torah, in the pure, fullest, clearest sense of the word in terms of Scripture, beyond just the law as Torah. So that question belongs to the church and the Old Testament church, not the New. So when the New Testament time, Carthage addressed it and included the Apocrypha, that's outside of their realm. When they did speak about the New Testament, they included all and only what we now have. And the argument is this, that if you get the Scripture is originating from God, because it comes from God and not from man, and we can get into the inspiration and various uses of inspiration, because it's given by God in the context of bringing man back from evil. God giving it to man and giving it in writing is given in the context of preserving it. Since it's given for all men, it's to be preserved from all that will go against it, including the malice of Satan and the malice of the world and the corruption of the flesh. That it would be preserved by God, because it's given by a singular providence, not general providence, a singular providence in giving it, and it can only come from God. It's preserved by a singular providence also, so that it's going to be kept pure and entire. Nothing will be added to it, and nothing will be eliminated from it. That's the argument given or being used in the Westminster Confession on the canon. And it says at the end of section 1, excuse me, let me back up here. Actually, section 8. It's being immediately inspired by God and by his singular care and providence kept pure in all ages. Yeah. So this is not something we're making up, but we're saying it's according to reason, and we can know that from, if it's given, it'll be preserved. And so we get necessity, content, origin, and existence. There is a book, a writing, that is consistent with clear general revelation, that addresses, affirms creation, fall, and redemption. Chapter 2 of Scripture affirms the covenant of creation, and it's in light of that covenant of creation, where Adam is representative head, that we have the fall, that his act affected everyone. And now redemption must take into account that covenant. So the promise of redemption is that through another in the place of Adam, God will undo what Adam did and do what Adam failed to do. And that's what we find in the promise in the garden: the seed of the woman shall crush the head of the serpent. The seed of the woman will not only be victorious over evil, but it also take away sin, signified in the coats of skin. So all of these things are there from the beginning. That's why we say Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and no other book, not building on that, affirms creation for redemption and is consistent with clear general revelation.
Well, that's a very good way to wrap up this episode, because that brings us up to the person and work of Christ, which we'll be looking at in Chalcedon.
Yes.
But we can also anticipate some objections from the modern world about Scripture, which we'll come back to when we are covering the modern age, which we'll do in a few episodes, because I think we'll be thinking more
There's
about...
There's more to be said about that in terms of transmission since that time, and which text do we use, Textus Receptus or some earlier text than that, and more tellingly, the sufficiency of Scripture, the completion and the sufficiency of Scripture, and as well as the interpretation of Scripture. Section 9 of the Confession speaks about interpretation, as well as some other places in that first chapter.
Yeah. Good. Well, thank you. Thank you for this, and as we've continued thinking about rebuilding the historic Christian faith and going through the challenges that were addressed at these councils. I also want to remind the audience about the webpage, which is thelogospapers.com, all one word, thelogospapers.com, paper number 11, which goes over from the move from general revelation to special revelation, which is some of what we've talked about today.
Yes.
So thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, Owen.